Hello again, Dan Alasso here, and today I am going to do another reaction to the second chapter in Abhijit Chavda's Understanding America series, where he looks at American history from a kind of a global perspective and from where he's sitting in India, which I think is a really interesting way to go. I have been hoping to do something kind of similar with world history, and maybe that'll be something that we can collaborate on in the future. And in this one, once again, we're still kind of dealing with the same book that I think he's basing these first 3 episodes on, and this is the second section of it that talks less about discovery and more about Spanish colonial efforts and Spanish exploratory efforts, and the ones that Abhijit is really fascinated with, and I think in this he's following the author's interest, are the ones that actually enter into North America. Now, even though I'm an American historian, I'm also a Latin American historian, so I'm a little bit less really specifically focused on the conquistadors who actually enter what is now the United States. But the ones that he is going to talk about are Cabeza de Vaca, Coronado, and De Soto. And there are some interesting things about those individuals. To begin with, he talks about the Reconquista, the reconquest of the Iberian Peninsula by the Spanish after it had been taken away from them by the Muslim people from North Africa that the Spanish called the Moors. And this is relevant not only in terms of an armed force that will ultimately go ahead and project itself outside of the Iberian Peninsula once it's done with that reconquest, which happens actually with the defeat and the surrender of the Emirate of Granada, actually in 1492. So a lot happens for Ferdinand and Isabella in 1492. They finish the Reconquista after 700 plus years of fighting to get this territory back from the Moors. And as I mentioned, I think in my comments on the first episode, one of the things that they developed during this period of reconquest is the encomienda, which is that land grant that also comes with a responsibility for making sure that the people living on the land actually do convert to Christianity, because as they're reconquering Iberia, of course, those people would have been Muslims. And so you get the grant of the land and you get access to the work and the product of the work of those people whom you are responsible for ensuring remain loyal Christians. And of course, if you're a believer, that means that you're saving their souls. Now, I want to just also kind of stress that this 700 years of this warrior culture certainly does something to the psychology, not only the ethos of the hidalgo, the more or less common person who can be ennobled by way of military service and success, but also just a kind of a more generalized understanding of people's role in the world. And yes, the Treaty of Tordesillas, I talk about that in both my American history and in my world history surveys. The Treaty of Tordesillas is this absurd thing where a previous pope had granted to Portugal the right to, quote unquote, own all of the lands that they discovered that don't already have pre-existing Christian populations. And then once Columbus discovers the Caribbean, a Spanish-born Pope, Alexander VI, whose Spanish name is Rodrigo Borgia, and he actually becomes the progenitor of the famous family of poisoners, the Borgias in Italy, starts to change that ruling in favor of the Spaniards. And so King João of Portugal starts to negotiate with Ferdinand and Isabella, and they come up with this Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 that divides the world along this meridian, about 350 miles west of the Azores, which are the westernmost islands that are known off the coast of Africa. And of course, Portugal gets what's to the east of that because they are already planting colonies like Angola in West Africa. And they've already discovered that you can go around the bottom of Africa and get to Asia. And so they want to protect that route. And so at first it seems like maybe the Spanish are getting the kind of short end of that stick. But that's only because people are unaware at that point how much there is to the west of that line, which actually does pass through the eastern part of South America, and that's why Brazil is Portuguese. But there's so much to the west of that line, not only in the rest of South America and Central America and North America, but also ultimately in the Pacific and the Philippines, which the Spanish will go on to conquer and make part of their empire. But yes, that is patently absurd, that these two nations are going to make this agreement and then the Pope in Rome is going to bless it, and that's somehow going to be considered a legitimate outcome for the world. And then Abhijit's partner there, who is sort of moderating this talk that he is giving, also mentions that the Portuguese have, by the time, even really before Cortez attacked the Aztec Empire, the Portuguese have arrived in India and have started to set up their trading system there, which I think that's a really interesting thing to keep in mind, that in the 1510s, the Portuguese are really moving forward with this plan. And theirs is not quite as much of a settler colonial type of project as that of the Spanish and then later of the Dutch and the English, especially in North America. But that it's more about controlling trade and especially controlling ports and sometimes potential choke points of transportation like the Straits of Malacca. And so I think it is interesting to note that that is beginning to happen for the Portuguese at this time. Because, of course, later, once we get past 1588 and the British and the Dutch have conquered the Spanish Armada, which also includes the Portuguese, the Dutch will begin to take over that Portuguese network in the Indian Ocean and all the way to what become the Dutch East Indies and ultimately later Indonesia. So yeah, that's a very interesting point that is already beginning to develop. And Abhijit tells a really interesting story about the Narvaez expedition into Florida and how that kind of fails and how a few people survive it, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and also Estevanico, the Moor, who was a North African who had been enslaved by a Spaniard who was on that expedition as well. In a lot of accounts, he's referred to as Esteban, especially in the Coronado account. They mention both names. I don't often spend quite as much time on the Cabeza de Vaca story, but maybe I will pay a little bit more attention to it because it is quite an amazing trek that he makes from Florida all the way to ultimately the Gulf of California and then back down into Mexico, to Mexico City. And I haven't actually read his entire book yet, so that's something that I still have ahead of me. The Coronado expedition I do spend a little bit more time on because that idea of going all the way to what's now Kansas to search for these potentially rich cities, and it all being a hoax designed by the native peoples to get these invaders to move on to another place, is kind of interesting and kind of ironic. So I like that story, and I use that quite a bit myself as well. The one that I actually spend the most time on really is the De Soto expedition, because De Soto travels around the entire kind of southeast. And then he dies of a fever and is thrown into the Mississippi River. The way that I have heard the story from the primary source testimony seems to suggest that they had been trying to trick the natives right there and then, at least, into thinking that they were some type of god or demigod sort of figures. So the idea that the leader had died was potentially very embarrassing to them. So they tried at first to hide the body. Then when it became clear that the natives were becoming suspicious, they dumped it in the river. And then Moscoso did help the survivors continue on their way and ultimately find their way back to Mexico City once again. And one of the things that I think is most interesting about that is that the accounts of this trip show that this area was heavily, heavily populated, that every place they went, they were finding villages and towns and little cities. And this seems to be the southern remnant of the Mississippian culture, which had probably peaked in the late 1300s, with its center at a place on the Mississippi River farther north, across from St. Louis, that we now call Cahokia. But although Cahokia had faded away, apparently the southern Mississippians were still doing pretty well and their population was still very high. But that the really interesting thing is that this area becomes depopulated between the 1540s, when DeSoto and his people are traveling around and spreading disease, and then the 17th century, when ultimately the French start to come in. When people like Champlain and La Salle will discover the Mississippi River. And when La Salle writes about his trip floating down the Mississippi, he travels for hundreds of miles and sees no one. It has reverted to something like wilderness because disease has wiped out all of these people. And I want to call attention to something that Abhijit says about disease. At one point in this second video, he makes note of the fact that Coronado and his people seem not to have brought disease to the Pueblo people of the Southwest. And that may have been true. I'm not 100% sure of that. But if it is true, climate and situations like that may have had something to do with that. But in any case, I think it's very likely that the DeSoto expedition did spread a lot of disease. And that and other occasional contacts, like with missionaries, probably caused a population disaster in what became the southeastern United States that has, for the most part, gone unnoticed by historians because Westerners weren't actually seeing it happen. Now, Abhijit suggests that the idea of disease has been used to kind of absolve Europeans for all of the brutality and all of the savage things that they did to native peoples. And that's not how I use it. And I don't think that most people following in the tradition of Alfred Crosby, from his book, The Columbian Exchange, and then his following book, Ecological Imperialism, I don't think that that is the point that they're trying to make. If anything, I think that what Crosby was trying to do was to debunk the idea that there was something so special about the Spaniards, or with their military technology, that a few hundred conquistadors had actually been able to conquer empires made up of millions of people. And so I think that was the myth that Crosby was debunking, and that's the way that most environmental historians, at least, have approached the idea of disease. Not that it gets any Europeans off the hook for anything, but that it makes this wildly uneven confrontation a little bit more understandable. And the other thing that I would focus on, I think, also would be the social chaos that ensues from just an unexplained pandemic that wipes out 50%, 70%, 90% of your population, just at a time when these new people are arriving. And Abhijit does talk a little bit about shatter zones. And he does mention the idea, which I think is very accurate, that there were completely new organizations and completely new relationships and groupings of these people. And that what become known in the Southeast as the 5 civilized tribes, the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole, were probably not all in those places or arranged in those ways prior to this incredible disaster in the 16th and 17th centuries that completely changed their world. And so I do think that we can't really underestimate the effect of both the social chaos within communities that happens when 90% of the people die, and then also the power relationships and the alliances that have to change. And we'll see this later when the English arrive and they meet Squanto on Cape Cod, who had been a Patuxet Indian, but while he had been in Europe being enslaved by Europeans and learning English, his entire people had been wiped out by disease. And then the Plymouths, of course, came and settled on the village of Patuxet and called it Plymouth. And so I think that that's going to be an ongoing story. And one thing that I like to stress about the Columbian Exchange is that it wasn't just something that happened in 1492 or in the early 1500s. but that it continued. And that as it continued to have significance politically and culturally, and in terms of balances of power between not only native groups and other native groups, but native groups and white settlers who were continuing to advance westward. This happens in the 1830s with the Mandan Indians, who are really wiped out by smallpox at just the time when steam-powered riverboats are beginning to make their way up the Missouri River and allow settlement and allow commerce to reach all the way really to Fort Benton in Montana. So there'll be a lot more to say about that as we go forward. But in any case, I think that this was another good installment in this series, and I'm looking forward to seeing where it goes. So I hope you found this a little bit interesting. Thanks for watching. I'll see you again very soon.